Hello, my name is Van Weigel, and welcome to this three-part introduction to business ethics. We begin with a very interesting factoid, and that is business ethics as an academic discipline was born and bred in the United States. It arose out of the concerns of post-Watergate America that something was wrong with our social institutions. Something was wrong in government as well as in our business institutions, and that we needed a more robust understanding of corporate social responsibility to fill the gap between the way things are and the way things should be. And to understand this better, we need to understand why Watergate had such a corrosive impact on American culture. We have pictured here, of course, President Richard Milhous Nixon, who was forced to resign in disgrace as a result of it being proven through the White House taping system that he had lied to the American people about his participation in the cover-up of the Watergate burglary. This had such an incredibly disturbing effect on most Americans because, believe it or not, many Americans believed that presidents simply do not lie unless they have a very, very good reason for doing so, like covering up the details of the D-Day invasion of Normandy. So this was intensely disturbing for Americans to know that their president had engaged in such a consistent, self-serving, and bald-faced lie to the American people. Then, as the decade of the 70s moved forward, there were concerns about American businesses who would put their interest above the interest of their customers. And chief among these was the controversy associated with the decision on the part of the Ford Motor Company not to recall the Ford Pinto, as the particulars were published in 1977 in a famous article in Mother Jones magazine. And I'll say more about that during part 2 of this presentation. And then also, as the 70s went into the 80s and 90s, with increased globalization, there was increasing concern about the normal standard fare assumption that when in Rome, do as the Romans do, might not be the appropriate approach for American business. This began with concerns associated with South Africa and its brutal racist policy of apartheid, separation of the races. And the fact that General Motors and IBM did business in South Africa was of concern because it may be that this practice of apartheid was being supported because of South Africa's continued commerce with the rest of the world, and using especially IBM computers or GM vehicles for its police forces. This led many people on American college campuses to call for a boycott of American business in South Africa. And then there were alternative voices like Leon Sullivan, who called for a program of constructive engagement. And I'll say more about that in part 2 of this presentation. And then we also had the controversy in the 1990s associated with the Nike Corporation and its use of child labor and grossly underpaid workers to manufacture shoes that were sold at a price point north of $150. So these we will talk about in more detail in part 2 of the presentation. Now, what is business ethics? I define business ethics in this way. It is the application of ethical theory to business context. And there are 3 basic schools of ethical thought that I'd like to draw your attention to: rights-based theories, consequentialist theories, and virtue or character ethics. I'll be saying a lot more about rights-based theories and consequentialist theories in a subsequent presentation. Now, rights-based theories operate on the premise that we can know what is right or wrong based on applying some universal ethical principle to a particular real life context. And the gold standard of rights-based theories, in my estimation, is none other than the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This ethical principle in some form is ubiquitous. It is found around the world, and it is also a principle that is so clear that an 85-year-old person can understand it and a 5-year-old person can understand it. It has such intergenerational power, I think, due to the fact that the Golden Rule draws upon the human capacity for empathy and for understanding and compassion. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Walk a day in another person's moccasins. A very, very powerful principle. Another very powerful principle is Jesus' second great commandment: love thy neighbor as thyself. This principle has formed the basis of Christian ethics since the first days of Jesus of Nazareth up until our current day. Neighbor love has been a focal point of many groups that have done incredibly courageous things to help other people out of love for them because of their love for God. Then we also have a very interesting theory that actually grew out of the Christian tradition called natural law theory. And one of its major proponents is pictured here, St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas believed that in the act of God creating the universe, he set up a kind of moral blueprint that would indicate what is right or wrong if you paid attention to the nature of reality and we're not blind to it. You would be able to discern God's blueprint, God's moral blueprint, by simply understanding the way the world works. And a key element of natural law theory is the notion of proper function. Human beings, for example, have their own proper function, their own capabilities. We are very much social creatures, for example. And so as a result, we have self-interest, but there's also a need for the common good. And so understanding humans really requires some notion of a common good that transcends individual self-interest. Similarly, other creatures like dogs or horses also have their proper function. Now, one of the fascinating aspects of Aquinas' notion of natural law is that he used that to bring insight to a commonplace dilemma where merchants would take advantage of a shortfall in supply or a spike in demand to raise their prices and exploit their customers. And Aquinas believed that, truthfully, the obligation of merchants should be to maintain what he called a just price. And by a just price, he was referring to the traditional price, but foreshadowing the very important economic concept of the long-run non-inflationary equilibrium price. Aquinas gave this example. Say a ship was lost at sea. The cargo it carried, cloth, spices, and other things, is now at the bottom of the ocean. Those individuals in the port city, those merchants in the port city who had inventory of those products, obviously could charge a lot more as a result of the ship being lost at sea. But Aquinas argued no, in fact, they should adhere to the just price, that it's not as if we should price simply by what the market would bear according to the law of supply and the law of demand. And what's striking about Aquinas' theory is that there have been quite a few interesting studies done that look at merchant behavior in the aftermath of natural disasters. And strikingly, they show a tendency toward price restraint when they could extract a much higher price. And in some cases, when people basically cast their cares to the wind and decide to exploit their customers, they're out of business 6 to 9 months later because of the tremendous offense felt by the community that they were being taken advantage of during their time of need. Now, this picture is of Immanuel Kant, and he has had an outsized impact on philosophy in general and moral philosophy in particular. He is famous for a moral principle concept called the categorical imperative that basically calls for a process of thinking universally about the sorts of things that one might want to do. When my mother said to me, Van, I don't think you should go ahead and do this because what would happen if everybody did it? She was thinking as a Kantian. And it's a very, very powerful theory that addresses what Kant believed was the great human weakness when it came to morality, and that is the tendency to exclude oneself, to say that the rules apply to everyone else, but they don't apply to me. One interesting thought experiment of the categorical imperative is known as the New York Times test. Say, for example, I'm considering option A or option B. Option A seems like, yeah, this is the right thing to do, but it doesn't meet as many of my own personal interests as pursuing option B, which is more attractive to me. So I should ask myself this question. Let's say I do pursue option B. What happens the next morning when I open up the New York Times to the front page and read exactly what I did? Am I cool with that? Or would I hold my head in shame when my colleagues, when my family and friends learn about this as reported in the New York Times? So that principle of publicity or test is a great example of this Kantian concern for the need for universalization and publicity. Then we have John Rawls, the late John Rawls, philosopher at Harvard University, who wrote in 1970, excuse me, he published in 1971 his theory of justice that has had an incredible impact on our thinking about the nature of justice, particularly in cross-cultural context. Many, many books have been written about his 550-page theory of justice, and tens and thousands of articles have been written about his theory. He has had such an incredible impact in the late 20th and early 21st centuries in our thinking about justice. And I'll say more about Rawls' theory along with the Golden Rule, Jesus' second great commandment, and Kant's categorical imperative in a separate presentation. Next, we have consequentialist theories, and chief among these consequentialist theories is known as the theory of utility or traditional utilitarianism. And basically, utilitarianism has as its foundation the notion that to determine what is right or wrong, we need to assess the consequences of a particular action or a particular policy. And if the consequences yield more utility or pleasure or happiness than disutility or pain or unhappiness, then those actions are good. If they yield conversely more pain than pleasure, more unhappiness than happiness, or more disutility than utility, then those actions would be judged to be wrong. Now, the founder of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, is pictured here. And Bentham believed that throughout history, until he discovered the greatest happiness principle, that throughout history, when people thought of things as right or wrong, they were actually doing a kind of informal utilitarian analysis of things and thinking that, again, right had more to do with not because God said this is right or because the king said that it's a good thing to do, but instead they were making their own kind of offhand rule of thumb utilitarian judgment about the nature of what the consequences of particular actions would be. Now, he himself had a very strong commitment to social justice. He was very concerned about the penal system in England of his day and the need to bring into some kind of calibration the punishment for a crime, with the nature of the crime itself. Also, he was very committed to democracy. In fact, the phrase one man, one vote came from Bentham. He was also concerned about the rights of laborers and also concerned about the use of children in factories. So he was a strong proponent of child labor laws and also the union movement. And he was also a very strong proponent of the new form of industrial organization known as worker-owned cooperatives that gave workers a greater degree of control and stake in the companies that they worked with. So Bentham has many, many fine traits associated with him, but there was also a quirky side to Bentham, and you can see that quirkiness here. This is literally Jeremy Bentham in the flesh from the University of London. He had a strong feeling toward the faculty of the University of London and made a donation upon his death to the university with this proviso, and that is that he would be embalmed, and as you see him here, and then rolled out once a year to a faculty meeting. Now, for my money, the idea of spending the afterlife in a faculty meeting would be a pretty close definition of hell for me, but not for Bentham. He really wanted to do that. Now, going back to his theory, Bentham had the belief of, and this is, I'm sure, related to his strong conviction of democratic equality, that all pleasures were equal. That he would say sometimes pushpin is as good as poetry. Pushpin would have been a game played by the lower classes of England, similar to our checkers, and poetry would be something that you'd have to be educated and have some appreciation for literature to be able to understand and derive pleasure from. So Bentham's saying it doesn't matter what pleasures you're talking about, they're all created equal. The other, one of the disciples of Bentham was named James Mill. And James Mill happened to have a son who is John Stuart Mill. James Mill was a well-known economist at the time, and he was committed to the principles of utility and to raising his son according to Benthamite principles, but he was very careful not to indoctrinate his son in this new theory of utilitarianism. He wanted his son to come to accept the truth of utilitarianism on his own basis. And so he intentionally held Bentham's theory held knowledge of the theory away from his son until he could discover it on his own. And one of the things that John Stuart Mill did was basically to question the notion that all pleasures are equal. Mill thought instead that it seemed more reasonable to distinguish between higher and lower pleasures. There are certain pleasures like eating, sleep, sex, whatever, that seem like they're lower pleasures. And then there are other pleasures that deal more with the apprehension of beauty, friendship, the ability to converse with another person about great ideas. Those kinds of pleasures would seem to be higher pleasures. And so Mill made the distinction between lower and higher pleasures, and the effect of that was that it rescued utilitarianism from an early death, but it also introduced some inherent complexity to how we understand utilitarianism and how how you would actually apply it to the real world. Bentham spoke about a philosophic calculus, or sometimes this is referred to as a hedonic calculus, that would allow one to observe the impact of an action and then calculate the overall level of utility or disutility. That could work perhaps in a more straightforward way if you did not think about lower and higher pleasures. Because the moment that you introduce lower and higher pleasures, then the question is, well, like, what's the worth of 1 unit, 1 util of a lower pleasure in relationship to a unit of a higher pleasure? So that weighting problem becomes much more problematic. But suffice to say, utilitarianism today has, in many respects, in people's minds, won the day, largely because of the way that it was adopted in the context of the theory of economics, and especially modern cost-benefit analysis. And so we will see how this emerged in an interesting and distressing way when we talk about the Ford Pinto case. And then finally, our third school deals with virtue or character ethics. And the founder of virtue or character ethics is none other than Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics. And the basic kernel of the idea of character ethics is that to know what is the right thing to do, you need to look inward and you need to ask what kinds of virtues are necessary for people to cultivate in order to be good, credible, ethical decision makers. And in many respects, Aristotle would say you can't know what is good or bad apart from referencing good men. What good men do is going to determine what is the good thing. Aquinas also is a strong proponent of virtue or character ethics by virtue of the fact that he Christianized Aristotle and definitely carried that tradition into very strongly into the Christian orbit, particularly when it came to the issue of intentionality and the need to be well intentioned in our ethical conduct. And then pictured here is Stanley Hauerwas, who happened to be one of my former professors, who I had before he became famous, and he became very much the modern proponent of virtue or character ethics today throughout his work. And I want to draw your attention to two books in this regard. One is a book published in the mid 2000s named Faith and Fortune by Mark Gunther, who is a senior editor of Fortune magazine, because I think it reflects well this notion of virtue or character ethics. Gunther had the idea that it would be fruitful to go out into the highways and byways and examine what different businesses that are making an impact on American society are doing internally in terms of how they deal with issues of corporate purpose and how what motivates their employees. So we looked at companies like Timberland and Starbucks and Southwest Airlines and United Parcel Service and others, and discovered something quite interesting. And that was that these corporations were practicing what he called corporate spirituality, which seems incongruous because how can a corporation be spiritual? But in fact, that's what seemed to be taking place on the ground, that these corporations had such strong organizational cultures that they were practicing a kind of spirituality. One of the great examples of this is how Starbucks stayed with its sourcing practice in sourcing beans from coffee beans from small peasant farmers and compensating them appropriately for that, because it was part of their mission to make sure that they were taking care of people in the supply chain. When they were criticized by a number of fair trade organizations that their standards were different than the fair trade standards, Starbucks resisted that appropriately because they were concerned that if they adopted the fair trade approach, they would actually exclude some of the smallholder farmers that were benefiting from the initiatives that they had already undertaken. Now, another example of the notion of virtue or character ethics is seen in this book by David Brooks called The Road to Character. This book lays out in a very engaging fashion the lives of individuals who have had an outsized impact on our lives, who struggled in their development, and as a result of that struggle, um, emerged from that a strong sense of character. And one of the things that is quite striking about Brooks's book is the theme of humility and the idea that humility is one of the key traits that one would look for in terms of understanding character in other people. Another fascinating distinction that he makes is between resume virtues and eulogy virtues. Resume virtues dealing with, okay, here are the things that I bring to the table, my special skills and achievements. And eulogy values would have to do with how are we going to be remembered once we pass on. And his main point is that too much of our society is focused on resume virtues to the exclusion of eulogy virtues, which are really the lasting values that people should cultivate. So that brings us to the end of part one of this presentation, and we'll see you in part two.